The morning the trees disappeared, half the neighborhood acted like some kind of environmental crime had taken place. People were posting pictures in the community Facebook group, residents were asking questions, and the HOA board suddenly sounded a lot less cheerful than they had a few months earlier. One homeowner wrote that it was a shame to see such a beautiful community improvement destroyed. Another said whoever removed the trees should be held responsible. The funny part was that nobody seemed interested in asking the one question that actually mattered. Whose land were those trees on in the first place? Because if they had asked that question first, they would have discovered something the HOA had been trying very hard to ignore. Every single one of those maple trees had been planted on my property. Not near my property. Not along a shared easement. Not on HOA common land. Directly on land that belonged to me. And when you plant something on somebody else's property without permission, you don't get to act surprised when the property owner eventually decides to do whatever he wants with it. Now, before anybody starts imagining that I woke up one day angry and hired a bulldozer out of spite, that's not what happened. The truth is actually much more ridiculous than that. My name is Ethan Mercer, and I own about 40 acres on the edge of a subdivision called Brookstone Ridge. My family had owned the land long before the subdivision existed. Back when I was younger, the entire area beyond my pasture was farmland and open fields. Then developers showed up. Within a few years, there were hundreds of houses where corn used to grow. New roads appeared. Sidewalks appeared. Then came the HOA. Now, to be fair, I never had much trouble with them. We lived separate lives. They managed neighborhood landscaping and parking complaints. I managed hay fields, equipment sheds, and fence repairs. We weren't exactly neighbors in the traditional sense. We simply shared a property boundary. And that boundary was not a mystery. It had been professionally surveyed years before the subdivision was even approved. Steel survey markers sat in the ground. County records documented everything. Fence lines matched the legal descriptions. If somebody wanted to know where my property started and ended, they didn't need to guess. They just needed to look. That's why I was so confused one spring morning when I spotted a row of freshly planted maple saplings running along the back edge of my pasture. At first glance, they actually looked nice. Young trees spaced evenly every few yards, each one supported by wooden stakes and irrigation bags. Somebody had clearly spent time and money putting them there. My first thought wasn't anger. Honestly, I assumed somebody made a mistake. Property line errors happen all the time. A contractor misreads a map. A volunteer guesses wrong. No big deal. Usually a quick conversation fixes everything. Then about 3 days later, I opened my mailbox and found the HOA newsletter. Right there on the front page was a smiling article celebrating what they called their Community Shade Initiative. The board proudly explained that volunteers had planted dozens of maple trees along a walking path behind the neighborhood to improve the beauty of the community and create long-term shade for residents. As I kept reading, something immediately jumped out at me. The walking path they described wasn't actually theirs. It followed the edge of my pasture. Suddenly those trees didn't look like a simple mistake anymore. So I grabbed my survey documents and drove out to the field. I located the steel markers. I checked every reference point. Then I measured again just to make sure. The result wasn't even close. The entire row of trees sat several feet inside my property line. Every single one of them. No easement existed there. No shared use agreement existed there. The HOA had simply decided to plant trees on land they didn't own and apparently hoped nobody would notice. What made it even stranger was how confident they seemed. The newsletter didn't mention permission. It didn't mention coordination. It spoke as if the project had already been settled and accepted by everyone involved. That's when I realized this wasn't just about landscaping. Somebody on that board had convinced themselves that because their intentions were good, property ownership no longer mattered. And trust me, that kind of thinking almost always leads to trouble. Now let me pause the story for a second because this is where a lot of HOA conflicts start, and honestly, it's one of the most common mistakes people make. According to standard procedure, before any organization installs landscaping, fencing, drainage improvements, or permanent structures near a property boundary, they're supposed to verify ownership and confirm exactly where those boundaries sit. That isn't just good manners, it's basic risk management. From a legal perspective, good intentions don't magically create property rights. It doesn't matter whether you're planting a tree, building a bench, or creating a walking trail. If the land belongs to someone else, permission comes first. What's fascinating is that this is also a psychological trap. People often assume that if a project benefits a large group, the individual owner should simply cooperate. This is a psychological trap because it shifts attention away from ownership and toward emotion. Suddenly, the conversation becomes about being a good neighbor instead of respecting legal boundaries. And when that happens, organizations sometimes convince themselves that resistance is unreasonable, even when the property owner is completely right. After confirming the trees were sitting on my land, I decided to handle the situation the simplest way possible. I sent an email to the HOA board. No threats, no lawyer, no dramatic language. I attached a copy of the county survey, highlighted the boundary line, and explained that the newly planted maples had been placed inside my property. I even suggested that because the trees were still young, relocating them would probably be easy and relatively inexpensive. Honestly, I expected the whole thing to be resolved within a week. Instead, what I got back completely changed how I viewed the people running that neighborhood. 7 days later, an email arrived from the HOA president, a guy named Randall Pierce. The message opened politely enough. He thanked me for my feedback. He said the board appreciated community involvement. Then came the part that made me read the email twice. According to Randall, the trees were intended to benefit the entire neighborhood and were unlikely to interfere with my use of the property. Since they were small, decorative, and environmentally beneficial, the board believed leaving them in place would be the best outcome for everyone involved. I remember sitting there staring at my screen thinking, did this guy just acknowledge that the trees were on my land and then immediately explain why they planned to leave them there anyway? Because that's exactly what happened. There was no apology, no request for permission, no offer to purchase an easement, no proposal to compensate me. Just a polite version of, we know they're on your property, but we like them where they are. The more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it became. Imagine parking your car in somebody else's driveway and then explaining that moving it would be inconvenient because the neighborhood enjoys looking at it. That's basically the argument they were making. What fascinated me most was the confidence. They genuinely seemed to believe community benefit outweighed private ownership. And once I recognized that mindset, I stopped arguing. There was no point. People who convince themselves they're morally right rarely respond to facts. So instead of wasting months debating with the board, I went back to focusing on my property. The section of pasture where those trees sat wasn't some sacred nature preserve. It was working agricultural land. Over the years, I had used it for equipment access, hay operations, temporary staging areas, and occasional vegetation management. In fact, I already had plans for maintenance work later that year. The timing simply hadn't been finalized yet. As summer passed, the trees continued growing. HOA newsletters occasionally mentioned their successful shade project. Residents complimented the improvement. Some people even posted photos online celebrating how the maples would someday create a beautiful green corridor behind the neighborhood. Every time I saw one of those posts, I couldn't help laughing. Because the entire conversation was based on an assumption nobody had bothered to verify. Autumn finally arrived, and with it came the maintenance schedule I'd been planning for months. I contacted a local forestry contractor I'd worked with before. They specialized in small-scale agricultural clearing and vegetation management. Professional crew, fully insured, proper permits, experienced operators, the kind of people who did everything by the book. A few weeks later, their equipment rolled onto my property. A compact skid steer, a trailer, a wood chipper, several workers carrying maps and safety gear. Before they started, I met with the crew supervisor and reviewed the property boundaries. We walked the survey markers together. We examined the legal map. We identified every area scheduled for clearing. Then I gave him one simple instruction. Anything inside this property line is mine. Manage it accordingly. He nodded and went to work. Around mid-morning, the first maple came out. Then another. Then another. There wasn't any drama. No chainsaws roaring through ancient forests. No angry confrontation. These were young saplings only a few years old. The crew removed them efficiently, chipped the material, and loaded everything into trailers along with several volunteer trees and brush clusters already scheduled for removal. By lunchtime, the entire row was gone. By mid-afternoon, the ground had been graded and cleaned. Looking across the pasture, it appeared almost exactly as it had before the HOA ever launched its project. Open grass, clear access, functional agricultural land. The transformation was so complete that if someone hadn't known the trees had existed, they probably never would have guessed anything had changed. For about a week, nothing happened. Then the neighborhood reaction began. Apparently, residents walking the trail noticed the missing trees almost immediately. Questions started appearing online. HOA discussions became heated. People wanted explanations. Some assumed vandals were responsible. Others suspected theft. One resident even suggested reporting the matter to local authorities. The irony of that suggestion nearly made me choke on my coffee. A few days later, another HOA newsletter appeared. The wording was noticeably different this time. Gone were the cheerful celebrations and enthusiastic announcements. Instead, there was a short paragraph explaining that certain landscaping elements near the neighborhood boundary had unexpectedly disappeared. Unexpectedly. That word did a lot of work. What the newsletter carefully avoided mentioning was ownership. It didn't explain where the trees had been planted. It didn't explain who owned the land. It didn't explain that the removal occurred entirely within private property boundaries. It simply described the situation as an unfortunate surprise. Then came the moment I had been expecting. Randall called me. His tone was very different from his earlier email. Less confident. More frustrated. He asked if I knew anything about the missing trees. I told him exactly what happened. I explained that my forestry contractor had completed scheduled land management activities on my property. There was a long silence. Finally, he said, "Those trees were intended to serve the community." I replied, "Then they should have been planted on community property." Another silence. Then he asked why I hadn't notified the board before the clearing operation. I almost laughed. "I did notify the board," I said. "I emailed the survey. I explained the problem. You chose not to move them." He didn't have much to say after that. Because what argument was left? The trees belonged to the landowner. The land belonged to me. The clearing was legal. The contractors were licensed. The boundaries were documented. Every step had followed established procedure. Eventually the call ended. No lawsuit arrived. No county citation appeared. No environmental complaint materialized. Nothing happened because there was nothing that could happen. The facts were too clear. The board had gambled that I wouldn't enforce my property rights. They lost that gamble. The path behind the neighborhood still exists today. Residents still walk there every morning. Kids still ride bicycles along it. Dog owners still follow the route at sunset. The only difference is that now the trail runs beside open pasture instead of a decorative row of maple trees. And every time I drive by, I'm reminded of something funny about human nature. People often believe confidence can substitute for ownership. They think acting like something belongs to them long enough will somehow make it true. But reality doesn't work that way. Survey markers don't care about opinions. Property lines don't care about community newsletters. And land ownership doesn't disappear simply because a committee votes against it. In the end, the HOA got exactly what they paid for. Unfortunately for them, they planted it on land they never owned in the first place. Looking back now, years later, I honestly don't feel angry about any of it. That's probably the part people find hardest to believe. When viewers hear a story like this, they usually expect some deep personal grudge against the HOA, but that's never really been the case. I didn't remove those trees because I hated the neighborhood. I didn't do it because I wanted revenge. And I definitely didn't do it because I disliked trees. In fact, I've planted hundreds of trees on my own property over the years. What bothered me wasn't the landscaping. It was the assumption hiding underneath the landscaping. Somewhere along the way, a group of people convinced themselves that a good intention was enough to override somebody else's property rights. That's a dangerous habit, whether you're talking about an HOA, a corporation, a government agency, or even a neighbor next door. The lesson here is that boundaries matter most when they're inconvenient. Everybody respects ownership when it's easy. The real test comes when respecting ownership gets in the way of what you want. That's when character shows up. That's when organizations reveal whether they truly believe in fairness or whether they simply believe in getting their way. According to standard procedure, the entire conflict could have been avoided with a 5-minute conversation and a quick review of a survey map. That's all it would have taken. One phone call, one polite request, one honest discussion. If someone from the board had approached me and said, "We'd love to create a shaded walking path. Would you be willing to work with us?" There's a good chance we could have found a solution together. Maybe we'd have adjusted the location. Maybe we'd have created an agreement. Maybe I would have even donated part of the space. We'll never know because they never asked. Instead, they made a decision first and looked for permission later. From a legal perspective, that's where they lost the argument before it even started. Ownership isn't determined by popularity. It's not determined by how many people benefit. It's not determined by who has the better public relations campaign. Ownership is determined by documented rights, recorded boundaries, and established law. That's the foundation that allows neighbors to coexist peacefully in the first place. Without it, every dispute becomes a contest of who can apply the most pressure. This is a psychological trap that organizations fall into all the time. When a project sounds positive enough, people start assuming opposition must be selfish. But that's a flawed way of thinking. Sometimes the person saying no isn't being unreasonable. Sometimes they're simply protecting something that belongs to them. And if we stop respecting that distinction, then fairness becomes whatever the loudest group decides it should be. The funny thing is that the trees themselves were never the real story. The trees were just a symptom. The real story was about entitlement disguised as community spirit. It was about a board that believed good intentions exempted them from basic rules. And it was about what happens when those assumptions collide with reality. Today the walking path is still there. The neighborhood is still there. Life moved on. Most residents probably don't even remember the controversy anymore. But every now and then somebody asks me whether I regret removing the trees. My answer is always the same. No, because I didn't remove community property. I didn't destroy somebody else's project. I simply managed my own land after giving the responsible parties every opportunity to correct their mistake. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have left the trees alone for the sake of community harmony? Or would you have done exactly what I did and enforced your property rights? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always spark debate, and honestly, that's part of what makes them so interesting. Sometimes the biggest neighborhood conflicts aren't about money at all. They're about where people think the line is, and whether they're willing to respect it when it's finally pointed out.